at the cusp of something that makes a huge difference. As many of us know firsthand, probably most of us on some level who are in this room, on one level, the open view seems like a very minor difference, a little theological tweak. Because it really comes down to just saying possibilities are real. That really is what it comes down to. Possibilities are real, and therefore God knows possibilities as possibilities. But on the other hand, that little tweak can make a whole lot of difference. And for many of us, it's a game changer. Tomorrow we'll hear Jessica tell her story, and it's a story about the enormous difference that this view can make in the midst of tragedy. In times of tragedy, that's where you really find out, that's where the rubber hits the road, and you can really find out the difference that your picture of God makes. And so this is why I think this conference is timely. I think it's necessary. I think it's so important. And I think we should all feel privileged to be a part of this. I look out at this group right now, and what I see are pioneers of this rising Reformation, pioneers of a picture of God and an understanding of God's relationship to the world that is, I think, going to change the face of the Christianity of the future. And so what I want to do is I'm going to talk a little bit, the title I'm supposed to dialogue on is the hope and the history and the hope of the open view. I'm going to get my water ready because my voice gets raspy, has been raspy lately, and so I want to keep it lubricated as good as possible. The history and the hope of open theism. And what I like to do is start by zooming out to look at the big picture. Instead of beginning really with the history of the origins of the open view of the future, I think it makes more sense to start with the history of the closed view of the future. And here's why. Because everybody, regardless of what they believe, everybody lives like an open theist. Have you noticed that? It is the natural way to live. And on one level, you could say that open theism is just a matter of saying, you know, the way that you experience the world, well, that's right. Everybody lives like an open theist. Every decision that we deliberate about, it assumes that you believe that there are possibilities in front of you, and with every decision that we deliberate about, we presuppose that we act on the assumption that it's up to us to resolve those possibilities. And so if I'm trying to decide, as I was earlier today, should I wear the brown shirt or the blue shirt? Is this blue? Gray shirt. I'm colorblind. What color shirt should I wear? And now, when I'm doing that, I assume that it's possible that I could wear the brown shirt or the gray shirt. And I'm assuming, as I'm deliberating, that it's up to me to decide whether I'll wear the brown shirt or the blue shirt. I'm the one who resolves those possibilities. There's no other way to deliberate. And yet I'm acting on the belief that possibilities are real and it's up to me to resolve them. There is no way for me to deliberate between these two shirts. What shirt should I wear? There's no way for me to deliberate in such a way that I manifest the belief that the fact of what shirt I will wear was decided before I resolve it. I might believe that, but I can't act on that belief. The only way you can act is on the belief that the future is partly open. Now, Charles Peirce, the great American philosopher, he said that a belief that can't make any difference on how you act when acting counts is a belief that's devoid of meaning. If you can't act on it to illustrate your belief that it's true, then it's a belief that's devoid of meaning. So if he's right about that, then the belief that the future is exhaustively settled is not just mistaken, it's meaningless. It's pragmatic criteria for truth. And now, whether you agree with that or not, one thing is clear, and that's that the belief that the future is exhaustively settled is a belief that is unnatural to us, because we are going to live differently regardless of whether we affirm it or deny it. We'll live like open theists. And so the real interesting question isn't when did the open view of the future start? Human beings have been living like the future was open since we started to think. And even before then. Because even if dogs have to make decisions, they're open theists too. Dogs don't believe that their choices are resolved in eternity before. Should I pee on this hydrant or that hydrant? So many possibilities. How do you resolve them? Go. All right. Get this straight. So the interesting question is when did this settled view of the future come into being? Now, this is a topic that I've got to be careful with because I've been exploring this thing for 15 years, and I'm doing it as part of a project. Some of you know this, as part of a project to explain how the early church went from a warfare worldview in the New Testament to a blueprint worldview in St. Augustine, and that in the span of 400 years. It was originally supposed to be, I was contracted to have a 300-page book for University Press that would be published as Myth of the Blueprint, and it was due 2001. So I'm now 12 years over date. And now the contract has grown to a 2-volume work, 1,000 pages apiece. So it's gotten massive. And it's because there's so many defenders that you got to get around. But that's the interesting question. Where did the settled view of the future originate? For tonight, I'll just point to two things, two aspects of ancient Greek culture that I think were the most forceful in bringing about and strapping Western culture with a settled view of the future, despite the fact that we're going to live the opposite of that. But we've been strapped with a settled view of the future for thousands of years, I think primarily for these two reasons. There's other reasons, but here's the two main ones. The first one is one that defenders of the settled view of the future are not going to like very much, but it's absolutely the case. And that is, it's anchored in occult practices in ancient Greece. Ancient Greece was, going back even before the time of Homer, the culture was steeped in divination. It was a central aspect of Greek society. People consulted the oracles for everything. Political leaders didn't do anything without consulting the oracles, and they had various ways of divining what the future held. But that was a staple of their culture, just foundational. In fact, the primary function of ancient Greek religion was to provide a way of knowing what the future holds. And courting the gods and doing various things that would court the gods' favor so that they would reveal to you what the future holds. And at some point, it was around the time of Homer, people began to realize a problem. And that is that if the gods can tell us what the future holds, that means the fact of what we will choose is out there for the gods to know. And if the fact of what we're going to do is out there for the gods to know, then we can't change it. And if we can't change it, how can we be morally responsible for it? And so that set in place a long string of philosophizing that I'll talk about in a moment, where people really wrestled with this idea of how can we be free and morally responsible, and yet the fact of what we shall choose is there, presumably from all eternity, certainly before we choose it. This is why you find in the ancient Greek tragedies, the main themes that they deal with is fate and free will. Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king. You know, it starts with this oracle that he will kill his father and marry his mother. And the tragedy is that regardless of what he does and what others do to help him avoid that prophecy, it only serves to fulfill the prophecy. That's the tragedy. He's fated, and there's nothing you can do about it. That was the dilemma that they were under with this understanding, that divination. And everyone assumes, except for the Epicureans, everyone assumes that at least up to around 400, that they're called works, divinization works. Cicero begins to poke fun at it and stuff in his treatise on the gods, but that's the working assumption. So that was one of the main things that put in place this idea that the future is settled. It was anchored in the occult. A second thing has to do with a strand of Hellenistic philosophy that's mainly manifested in the Platonic stream of Hellenistic philosophy. And it's rooted in this philosophical assumption that to explain anything that's not self-explanatory, to avoid an infinite regress, you have to postulate its antithesis. What I mean by that is this. Thank you. Can you elaborate a little bit? So what needs explaining in this world is contingency, the fact that things could be other than they are. That needs explaining. It's not self-explanatory. And change, things change. That's not self-explanatory. And we have a world in which things are differentiated from one another, and that's not self-explanatory. So the multiplicity of the world, the contingency of the world, and the change of the world needed explanation. But to avoid an infinite regress, you can't postulate another contingency or another changing thing or another multiplicity. You have to rather postulate something that's not contingent, not changing, and not manifold. And so now we arrive, right? And this goes back to Thales. It's best illustrated in Parmenides, but the assumption then is that the ultimate explanation of the world has got to be something that's altogether necessary, not contingent, something that is unchanging, and something that is absolutely indivisible, simple, one. The search for the one. And so that assumption then leads in the Platonic tradition to the way you arrive at the conception of ultimate reality is by stripping away everything in our world that is not self-explanatory. You strip away all contingency, all multiplicity, and all change, and that arrives at ultimate reality. That is their model of perfection. And for those of you who know a little bit about classical theism, you'll see here, this is the classical view of God. For all intents and purposes, this is the origin of the classical view of God. God is perfect because God is altogether immutable, unchanging. God's altogether necessary, not contingent. God's altogether simple, not composite, not involving a multiplicity. That was their ideal of perfection. And if ultimate reality, follow this, if ultimate reality is altogether necessary, immutable, unchanging, impassible means it can't be affected by anything, then everything that we see that does change, that does move, and that is manifold must be something less than ultimately real. If ultimate reality is that, well then this world of contingency and change and multiplicity must be sort of quasi-real. And this is what's expressed in Plato in the Timaeus when he has this famous quote. He says, "Time is the moving shadow of eternity." Time is the moving shadow of eternity. What is really real is the eternal, the unchanging, the necessary. That's what's really real. Time and change, this world, is a moving shadow of it, which means that nothing can happen in time which wasn't already there in eternity. In this timeless, atemporal, unchanging one reality. When the Christians appropriate that model of perfection, look what happens. When Christians adopt that model, which they did quite early, then it's the case that nothing can happen in time that wasn't there in the mind of God from eternity, in the plan of God from eternity. God exists in this timeless present. And so everything that happens down here is it plays out the blueprint, the eternal blueprint in God's eternal mind. That is the second major force that moves Western culture towards this idea of the future being exhaustively settled. The difference between that Hellenistic, which means Greek-like, that model of God and his relationship with the world, the difference between that on one hand and the Hebraic model on the other is absolutely massive. They're totally different. In the Jewish worldview, in the Hellenistic worldview, you arrive at God by way of reason. It's humans searching for God by means of reason. Whereas the Hebrews were just bearing witness to a God who they knew through revelation. God came to them. In the Platonic tradition, God is arrived at by negating the contingent, ever-changing world. But in the Hebraic tradition, they know God precisely because God immerses himself in the contingent, ever-changing world. And so in the Platonic tradition, contingency and change and time are viewed as negative things. But in the Hebraic worldview, they're seen as positive things because God created them, and contingency and change is the stage upon which God reveals himself. They're positive things. Whereas in the Hellenistic worldview, change and contingency and those things became negative and only sort of quasi-real. In the Hebraic worldview, they're seen as absolutely positive, part of God's good creation. And so while Platonists arrive at a divine perfection that's frozen and passionless and unaffected and unchanging, the Hebrews bore witness to a God whose perfection was precisely because he's not that. This God is perfect because he's willing to be flexible. He's willing to move with us. He's willing to be impacted by us. He's willing to change with us. And so the dynamism of the Hebraic tradition really culminates with the Christian proclamation that God became a human being. It's the most dynamic thing. God immerses himself into our humanity. And the passion in the Hebraic tradition, they weren't afraid of God having strong emotions. Read your Old Testament. Man, God's got a lot of strong emotions. And all that culminates when Jesus not only becomes a human being, but he dies on the cross. He suffers and dies on the cross. This is a God who's willing to suffer. I don't know if you could get a more different view of God from this Hellenistic view on the one hand and the Hebraic Judeo-Christian view on the others. And yet the history of the church is one of starting to try to mold these together, find a way to fit them together. So the divinization began to influence the church. What I'm trying to show in this Myth of the Blueprint project is that both the divinization as well as this Platonic tradition, as well as the Stoic tradition that I'm not going to talk about tonight, but they begin to influence the church. The divinization begins to influence the church this way. With Justin Martyr and some of the other early apologists, these are folks who all were converted out of various Hellenistic philosophical schools. But what happens is that Justin Martyr, for example, he begins to read the prophecy in the Old Testament as through the grid of the Hellenistic model of prophecy. And among the Greeks, prophecy was about predicting the future. Among the Hebrews, prophecy was mainly about providing a warning to avoid a certain future. And but what happens with Justin Martyr is he begins to assume that prophecy means the same thing in the Old Testament as it meant in Greek culture. And so one of the ways he does kind of a Josh McDowell, evidence that demands a verdict, sort of apologetic, where he masses together all these supposed predictions that you find for Jesus' coming. Now, if you look at the actual verses, they don't predict anything. But this is Justin who's reading into Hebraic prophecy, a Hellenistic model of prophecy. Then the second thing that happens is this. Early on with the apologists, they start by using the language of divine perfection that you find in the Platonic stream of the Greek tradition. So they call God atemporal and impassible and immutable and other things. But it's clear that it's not the driver of their theology. The driver of their theology is the biblical narrative. They use these terms, but they don't do much. But over time, they start to do stuff. And the content of their theology becomes increasingly formed by these categories that are exported from the Greek theology into the Judeo-Christian theology. And then I argue that with St. Augustine, especially with St. Augustine, you have now the subversion of the biblical narrative as a driver by means of the Hellenistic model of perfection, which is now the new driver. The ultimate truth about God is given not from Scripture, but from reason. It's just assumed. And they don't notice that they're doing this. It creeps in at the level of the most basic assumptions. But it just is obvious to them that God is, of course, atemporal. God is, of course, impassible. God, of course, is immutable. It's just obvious. And so now they have to make sense of the biblical narrative, which has a God who's constantly changing and is very much in time and is having a lot of passion and emotions and things of that sort. And I estimate that about 90% of the mystery that accompanies classical theology is the result of trying to impose this Hellenistic model of perfection on a biblical narrative that just does not fit it. You have two very different conceptions of God and his relationship with the world going on here. And so now it becomes mystery. Mystery, or in such a way, becomes the coherence maker. By pronouncing it, all things are well, even though it looks like a contradiction. God is interactive with us in such a way that he is not. God is in time in such a way that he's outside of time. God is impacted by us in such a way that he's not impacted by us. And it goes on and on and on and on. That is the result of us adopting a settled view of the future when it wasn't part of the biblical narrative. Now, you find that throughout the history of Greek philosophy, the philosophers wrestled with this, trying to make sense of our human experience as being free and morally responsible, on the one hand, with the settled view of the future on the other. And they have at least 5 different ways of doing it, and I recount those in a different context. What's interesting, however, is that there were a few, who saw that it couldn't be done. And they become the first open theists. Now remember, they're only open theists. Well, actually, they're not open theists. The first ones were the Epicureans, and they were atheists. So they're the open atheists. But they held an open view of the future. And they saw it couldn't be done. So the Epicureans they said, look, if we are in fact free, then divination can't be true. So they rejected divination, first ones to do it. And they rejected belief in the gods. Unfortunately, what that meant was that the open view of the future was associated with atheism for centuries to come. And to believe in God simply meant you believe that the future was settled. That still is to a large degree true. People assume if you're a theist, well, then you must believe this. But that tradition goes way, way back. They denied bivalence. Now, bivalence is just the belief. It's a logical rule that says that any coherent proposition must either be true or false. Either it or its opposite must be true. And so the Epicureans said, well, look, it can't be the case. If it's true that I will, 5 years from now, crash my car into a tree, then I'm not free to avoid that. And if it's false, I'm not free to, avoid that either. So future tense propositions about free actions must lack all truth value. It's neither true or false. Everyone else thought that was crazy. That's counterintuitive. But that was one way of avoiding the problem. Some people argue that Aristotle held that same view, although I think it's quite clear he didn't. But there's in his book on interpretation, there's one passage, it's a famous sea battle analogy he uses of two generals going out to fight at sea. And he says, if it's true that they will fight, then they're not free to avoid the battle. And yet we want to say that they're free to either fight or not fight. What do we do with this? And he wrestles back and forth. And there's one statement where he seems to say it's neither true or false. But if you look at other things that he says, I think it's quite clear that he didn't mean that. Though scholars argue back and forth on that a lot. What is clear is that some of his followers held that view. Alexander of Aphrodisias held that, although he wasn't consistent with it, but he seems to have held that future tense propositions about free actions are neither true or false until we make them such. And then there was a group of Platonists who also embraced a kind of an open view of the future. Porphyry is one of these in the 3rd century, where they held what some scholars have called conditional fatalism. And they tried to, and interestingly enough, the only Christian open theist that we know of so far in the early church was a guy named Chalcidius. And he held this view. He was a Platonist and a Christian, and he held this conditional fatalist position. His book on fate is just so fascinating. Because he spends the whole time, conditional fatalists held this: your behavior is not fated, but the consequences of it are. So it's not fated that John will go out drinking, but it is fated that if he goes out drinking, he's going to crash his car. And this is the kind of view that Chalcidius holds. And then he holds that he spends a lot of time trying to show how you can interpret Greek tragedies this way. And you can interpret certain things that Plato said this way. He's not very concerned with Scripture at all. It's really interesting. He hardly wrestles with Scripture at all. Much more interested in Greek tragedies. But he was a Christian. What's also interesting is that he wrote a very famous commentary on Plato that was used throughout the Middle Ages. And what's interesting is I have not found anyone expressing any reservation about his open view of the future. It doesn't seem to have been an issue for anybody, even though his book on fate was already out there. So anyways, that's the ancient view of this. What is at, and I'm going to work very hard to only spend 2 minutes on this, because this will bore you crazy. But here's the thing. At the foundation of the problem, I wrote an article a couple years ago arguing that the root of the problem here is that these folks think that you either have to affirm bivalence and therefore have a settled future, or deny bivalence and therefore not have a settled future. And it creates all this conundrum. There's other, Platonists and Aristotelians who are saying, like, it's true, bivalence applies, but not definitely so. And they're just struggling to try to have some room for freedom and all this stuff. But the problem is that they're assuming that statements about what will happen and statements about what will not happen contradict each other. So either Greg will crash his car, or he won't, or it's false that he'll crash his car. But they don't realize, as Tom Belt and I and Ellen Rhoda showed several years ago, there are 3 possibilities with regard to future statements, not 2. You have will not, but you also have might and might not. And propositions, and they also have truth value. And if a statement about what I might and might not do is true, then statements about what I will do are false, and statements about that I will not do are also false, because it's right now not certain either way. Yes! Well, it hasn't caught on very well, but one of these days it will. It's just, so instead, and the problem goes back to Aristotle's square of opposition, because he was prejudiced towards determinism, because he put will and will not as contradictories when in fact they're contraries. What you need is 3 squares of opposition to both express the 3 prongs of possibilities with regard to future ontologies. I'll move on, because I can see eyes glazing over right now. So here's the thing then, that to move up through the Middle Ages, you have a school in Paris in the 13th century, Peter Oriol and some others, who, these folks, if you read them, they argue just like open theists. They use the logic that we use. They say that if our actions are foreknown as certain, then they cannot be free. I remember the first time I was reading these guys, and I was like, I discovered some open theists in the Middle Ages. I was so excited. And then at the last moment, strictly on the basis of church authority, they go, oh yes, and by the way, God is timeless. So they say God doesn't foreknow our actions. He knows them as present realities, which you think is wonderful, but then they say, oh, by the way, God's present is timeless. So God sees us all as a timeless. But it's only on the basis of church authority, and maybe, I suspect, to save their jobs, if not their lives, that they're throwing this out there. But for all the intents and purposes, they're open theists. They lay a foundation for what was to come, however, because as soon as you remove that church authority, boom, you've got open theists. And this is precisely what happens with the Socinians in the 16th century. Freed, now with the beginnings of the Reformation, freed from church authority, these folks use the same logic as these folks at Paris University, and they just get rid of that timeless deity. They think, where'd that come from? Which is a very good question, by the way. It comes from Plato, not from the Old Testament. And so they become open theists. And once you do that, they begin to notice, so far as I know, they're the first ones, because even Chalcidius didn't do this, but they start to notice that, man, from what we can tell, all the writings were burned, but from their critics, you can tell that they discovered that there's a whole bunch of stuff in the Bible that points towards an open future. And I think they're the first ones to really begin to embrace that. And then it goes on. Unfortunately, the Socinians also denied the Trinity and denied the atonement and had some other heresies. So once again, first open theism was associated with atheism, with the Epicureans, and now it gets once again associated with heresy with the Socinians. We can't win. God, we've had some bad breaks. And we still get this guilt by association thing all the time. I mean, there's folks out there who will label the open view the Socinian view, as though that was the most distinctive thing about Socinians. And there's no relationship between their open view of the future and their denial of the Trinity or their view of the atonement or anything else. But it just plays well to the right crowd. I think on that basis you should say that the Calvinists are actually Muslims because they have the same view of providence. But we wouldn't think that is very fair. And then, see, until recently, most of us only knew about Chalcidius, the Socinians, and then Billy Hibbert, who was this early 19th century Methodist circuit rider, and L.D. McCabe. They were really the only ones that we knew of from Chalcidius up until the present, in terms of folks who set a precedent for the open view of the future. And that's been repeatedly used against us. How many times have we read or heard folks saying, these arrogant open theists, no one else in church history saw this, but here they come along and they notice it. And really, that shouldn't matter, even if we couldn't find anybody else, because the Protestant Reformation was based on the maxim that the church is reformed and always reforming. And all the reformers held this. The church should always be humble and being reformed. God has new things to reveal to us. It's just that the tendency has been that as soon as a new group of Protestants comes along with a new truth, they want to say, oh, now it stops. Buck stops here. Reformation is climaxed here. No other newcomers allowed. It's just a little bit unfair. But illegitimate as it was, this has been a criticism that's repeatedly been raised against the open view. I remember sitting at a conference listening to Millard Erickson with John Sanders. And he was delivering this paper against open theism. And then at the end, he was raising this criticism that it's a novelty and how arrogant to think that you could see something that other church fathers, even Calvin didn't see this. What? How come? What? And then he notes, he made this note that Boyd in God of the Possible, he cites he cites Chalcidius and L.D. McCabe, and then this Billy Hibbert guy. And I have done exhaustive research on this and looked in the Library of Congress, and I can't find anything about a Billy Hibbert. And it's like, you're saying I'm lying? I made it up? I'm just going to make up somebody? I don't know what his point was, but afterwards, John was kind enough to go up and offer to share with him his copy of Billy Hibbert's memoirs to help this poor guy out. It was very nice of him.